Picture this. You're standing in the Chiricahua Mountains of what we now call Arizona, and it's 1850. The Spanish conquistadors are long gone, but their maps still mark these peaks as the edge of the known world. Out here, in country so harsh it would kill most people within a week, children are learning to survive in ways that would make a Navy SEAL instructor take notes. These aren't just any children. These are Apache children. And that word, Apache, here's the thing that gets me about it. The name itself means enemy. That's what their neighbors called them. The Zuni word apachu, enemy. But they never called themselves that. They called themselves Ndee, simply the people. Now think about what that tells you about their world. Your neighbors literally define you as the enemy, but you define yourself as simply human, the people. That's either supreme confidence or a worldview so different from ours that we can barely comprehend it. Maybe it's both. Let me paint you a picture of what childhood looked like for these people. A 10-year-old Apache boy, let's call him what his family might have called him, Little Thunder, wakes up before dawn in the high country. Not because someone tells him to, because by age 10, he already understands that sunrise brings safety, and safety brings opportunities his family needs to survive. His grandmother is already awake, naturally. She's been up for an hour reading the sky, and I mean really reading it. She can tell you if it's going to rain tomorrow afternoon by how the stars looked at midnight. She can predict a 3-day weather pattern by watching how the wind moves through specific types of clouds. This isn't folklore, people. This is meteorology developed by a culture that lived or died based on being right about the weather. While his grandmother reads tomorrow's forecast in today's sky, Little Thunder's grandfather is testing his memory. Tell me about the water sources between here and the blue rocks where the eagles nest, and Little Thunder better know. All of them. Not just where they are, but which ones run dry first in drought years. Which ones the deer use at dawn. Which ones might be contaminated if the whiteface cattle have been there. This is survival education that makes our modern wilderness training look like a weekend camping trip. By the time most kids today are learning their multiplication tables, Little Thunder can track a mouse across solid rock. He can identify edible plants that could keep him alive for weeks, plants that look identical to ones that would kill him in hours. He's learning to move through terrain so quietly that deer don't notice him until he's close enough to touch them. But here's what really gets me about this training. It's not just about individual survival. Every skill these children learn serves the survival of the entire group. Little Thunder isn't just learning to hunt for himself. He's learning to hunt in ways that don't alert enemies to his family's location. He's not just learning to find water. He's learning to find water sources that won't give away their camp to trackers following his footprints. This is military training disguised as childhood education. These kids are growing up to be the most effective guerrilla fighters in the history of North America, and they don't even know it yet. Let me tell you about the archery training. Apache boys started with miniature bows when they could barely walk. By age 8, they're hitting targets the size of your thumb from distances that would challenge modern Olympic archers. By 12, they can put an arrow through a rabbit's eye at 50 paces while moving, not standing still and taking careful aim, while running across uneven ground. Think about the level of hand-eye coordination that requires. Think about the hours of practice. But also think about this. They're not just learning to shoot. They're learning to make their own arrows, to recognize the best wood for different types of shots, to fletch arrows that will fly true in desert wind conditions that would throw off factory-made ammunition. This is engineering education, physics education, material science, all disguised as play. And the women, the girls are learning skills that are just as sophisticated, just as essential for survival. They're learning to weave burden baskets so tightly they can carry water without a single drop leaking through. They're learning to identify medicinal plants not just by sight, but by smell, by the sound their leaves make in the wind, by the way animals behave around them. An Apache woman named Lozan, we'll hear more about her later in our story, could stand in an open area with her arms outstretched and sense the direction of approaching enemies through tingling sensations in her palms. Now you can call that superstition if you want. But Lozan used this ability to guide her people to safety dozens of times over a career that spanned decades. Maybe it was heightened awareness of environmental changes. Maybe it was something else entirely. The point is, it worked. But there's something else these children are learning. Something that's going to become absolutely crucial to our story. They're learning about spiritual law. But what makes a person Apache and what threatens the very essence of Apache identity. And one of those laws, one that's going to matter more than any of us can imagine right now, concerns pork, pigs. In Apache belief, are unclean animals. They eat filth. They wallow in mud. They consume things that would make other animals sick. And because of this, consuming pork doesn't just violate dietary restrictions, it poisons the spirit itself. It corrupts the essential Apache nature of the person who eats it. To an Apache child in 1850, being forced to eat pork would be like being forced to drink poison. Not just physical poison, spiritual poison. The kind that could damn your soul for generations, remember that. Because in about 30 years, Apache children are going to face a choice, eat pork or starve. And when that moment comes, you'll understand exactly why some of them chose starvation. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Right now, in 1850, these spiritual laws seem as permanent as the mountains themselves. Apache children learn them the same way. They learn to track and hunt and find water. There's absolute truth about how the world works. Now let me tell you about the leaders these children are growing up around. Because the Apache of this era produced some of the most remarkable military and political minds in American history. Mangas coloradas, red sleeves, stood, nearly 7 feet tall, in a time when most men barely reached 5.5 feet. Legend said he could run down a deer on foot, not track it until it tired, literally run it down in a straight chase. The man was a physical specimen that would impress professional athletes today, but more than that, he was a strategist. He understood that the Apache way of life was under threat from multiple directions. Mexican armies from the south, American settlers from the east, economic pressures that were changing the entire Southwest, and he was trying to navigate a path that would preserve Apache independence while acknowledging the reality of changing times. Then there was Cochise, chief of the Choconan band, a leader so respected that Mexican governors in Sonora literally paid him tribute to keep their settlements safe. Not because they were weak, but because they understood that war with Cochise was war with a military genius who knew every trail, every water source, every hiding place between the Rio Grande and the Colorado River. These weren't savage war chiefs, despite what the history books used to tell us. These were sophisticated political leaders trying to manage an impossible situation. They were watching their traditional hunting grounds get carved up by international borders they had no part in creating. They were seeing their trade relationships disrupted by wars between Mexico and the United States, wars that had nothing to do with Apache interests, but everything to do with Apache survival. And the children? The children are watching, learning, absorbing lessons about leadership and strategy, and the delicate balance required to keep a people alive in a world that's changing faster than anyone can adapt to. Little Thunder and his friends don't know it yet, but they're growing up at the end of an era. They're learning skills that their great-great-grandfathers learned in landscapes that have remained essentially unchanged for thousands of years. They're absorbing cultural knowledge that stretches back to the migration from the northern forests, when their ancestors followed the buffalo and the seasons and the ancient stories that explained how the world came to be. But change is coming. It's already coming, actually, in the form of wagon trains and mining camps and territorial governments that don't recognize Apache sovereignty. The children can't see it yet, but their elders can. The wisest among them are already trying to prepare for a future that none of them can quite imagine. Some are counseling accommodation, find ways to work with the Americans as they've learned to work with the Mexicans, establish trade relationships, maybe even formal treaties. Others are preparing for war. Not the kind of limited warfare that Apache bands have always engaged in. Raids for horses and prestige and the settling of specific grievances. Totalva. The kind of conflict that ends with one side completely destroyed. And here's the tragedy that's approaching, though none of them can see it clearly yet. Both sides are going to be right. Accommodation is going to be necessary for Apache survival. And war is going to be inevitable, given the cultural forces already in motion. The children playing in the Chiricahua Mountains in 1850 are going to grow up to face choices their ancestors never had to face. They're going to have to choose between traditional ways that ensure spiritual survival and adaptive strategies that ensure physical survival. They're going to have to decide whether being Apache means maintaining every ancient custom exactly as it's always been done, or whether being Apache means ensuring that Apache people continue to exist in some form, even if that form would be unrecognizable to their grandparents, and some of those children who are right now, learning to track mice across solid rock and shoot arrows with Olympic precision. Some of them are going to end up in cattle cars, being shipped to prisons thousands of miles from everything they've ever known, but that's getting ahead of our story. Right now, in 1850, the world still makes sense. Apache children still learn Apache ways from Apache elders in Apache country. The mountains still echo with Apache voices, Apache ceremonies, Apache laughter. The storm is coming, though. And when it hits, it's going to test everything these children are learning. Every skill, every belief, every assumption about how the world works. The question is, will what they're learning be enough to survive what's coming? That's what we're about to find out. The year 1861 was supposed to be different. After decades of sporadic warfare with Mexico, after years of uncertainty about whether Apache lands would end up under Mexican or American control, things were finally settling down. The Americans had won their war, drawn their borders, and some Apache leaders were genuinely hopeful about the possibilities. Cochise was one of them. Now here's something that might surprise you. In early 1861, Cochise was actively seeking peace with the Americans. Not because he was weak. This was a man who had been fighting Mexican armies since he was a teenager and had never lost a major engagement. He was seeking peace because he was smart enough to see the writing on the wall. The Americans weren't like the Mexicans. The Mexicans were tough fighters, sure, but they had limited resources and competing priorities. They'd been fighting Apache raids for over 2 centuries, and they'd developed a kind of equilibrium. Violent, costly, but predictable. The Americans were different. They had resources the Mexicans could never dream of. More soldiers, better weapons, and most importantly, an apparently unlimited ability to just keep coming. Wave after wave of settlers, miners, ranchers, traders, and behind them always, the blue-coated cavalry. Cochise understood math. Simple, brutal mathematics. He could field maybe 60 warriors on his best day. The Americans seemed to have access to thousands of soldiers, with more arriving every month. In a war of attrition, there was only one possible outcome. So in early 1861, when American officials approached him about establishing a permanent peace, Cochise was interested. More than interested, he was hopeful. That hope was about to be destroyed by the single most catastrophic failure of cross-cultural communication in the history of the American Southwest. Let me set the scene for you. Apache Pass in what's now southeastern Arizona. It's January of 1861, and Second Lieutenant George Nicholas Bascom has been sent to investigate reports of a kidnapping. A rancher named John Ward claims that Apaches have stolen his stepson, a mixed-race boy named Felix, and some cattle. Now here's the first problem. Ward doesn't know which Apaches allegedly took his stepson. He just knows it was Apaches. To him, apparently, all Apaches are the same. It's like blaming all Americans for something done by a gang in Chicago. But Ward doesn't see it that way. The second problem is that Bascom is 24 years old, fresh out of West Point, and has been in Arizona territory for exactly 3 months. 3 months. He doesn't speak Apache. He doesn't understand Apache culture. He doesn't even understand the basic political structure of Apache bands, but he's been given orders to resolve this kidnapping. And by God, he's going to follow those orders. So Bascom sends word that he wants to meet with Cochise to discuss the stolen boy. And here's where it gets interesting. Cochise agrees to the meeting. Not only does he agree, he brings his wife, his children, his brother Koyuntura, and 2 of his nephews. Think about that for a second. Cochise brings his family to this meeting. His wife, his children. You don't bring your family to a military conference unless you're confident it's going to be peaceful. Unless you trust the people you're meeting with. Cochise trusted the Americans. That trust was about to be shattered in the most brutal way possible. The meeting takes place inside Bascom's tent at the stage station in Apache Pass. Cochise, his family and his relatives sit down with Lieutenant Bascom and his interpreter. And Bascom gets straight to the point. He accuses Cochise of taking Felix Ward and the cattle. Now here's the thing. Cochise has never seen Felix Ward in his life. He has no idea what Bascom is talking about. The Chiricahua band that Cochise leads hasn't conducted any raids in that area in months. If someone took this boy, it wasn't Cochise's people. Cochise tells Bascom this, honestly, directly. He explains that while he can't speak for all Apache bands, his people had nothing to do with this kidnapping, but he offers to help investigate, to use his contacts with other Apache leaders to find out what really happened. This is exactly what you'd want from a potential ally, right? Honest denial of involvement combined with an offer to help solve the problem. It's diplomatic. It's constructive. It's the response of a leader who wants to maintain peaceful relations. Bascom doesn't see it that way. Bascom has been told that Apaches took the boy. He's been sent to get the boy back from Apaches. He's looking at the most prominent Apache leader in the territory. As far as he's concerned, the math is simple. So Bascom does something that anyone with even basic knowledge of Apache culture would know was absolutely, catastrophically wrong. He decides to take hostages. I cannot let you go, Bascom tells Cochise, until the boy is returned. And just like that, the tent becomes a prison. Now imagine you're Cochise in this moment. You came here in good faith, bringing your family as a gesture of trust. You've honestly told this young officer that you had nothing to do with the crime he's investigating. You've offered to help solve it, and his response is to make you a prisoner. But it gets worse. Bascom isn't just holding Cochise. He's holding Cochise's brother, his nephews, his wife, his children. All of them. Because in Bascom's mind, they're all just Apaches, and all Apaches are apparently responsible for anything any Apache does anywhere. Cochise looks around the tent, at his terrified children, at his relatives, at the armed soldiers now pointing rifles at his family. And he makes a decision that's going to echo through history. He pulls out his knife. Now here's where the story gets almost cinematic. Cochise doesn't attack anyone. He doesn't try to fight his way out through superior firepower. Instead, he does something that shows just how well he understands both his own capabilities and the tactical situation. He cuts through the back wall of the tent and escapes, just like that. One moment he's a prisoner. The next he's gone, leaving only a slit in the canvas and the sound of soldiers shouting in confusion. But he can't take his family with him. The soldiers are too alert now, too ready. So Cochise faces the most agonizing choice any leader can face. Save himself and try to rescue his family later, or stay and watch all of them become prisoners together. He chooses to run, and as he's escaping, the soldiers open fire. Bullets rip through the tent. Cochise is hit, blood streaming from wounds on his body, but he makes it to the rocks outside the station. From those rocks, he shouts back at Bascom, "You have started a war that will last until one of us is dead." And you know what? He was absolutely right. The war that started in that tent in January 1861 wouldn't end until 1872. 11 years, over 4,000 deaths, millions of dollars in damage. Entire regions of the Southwest turned into no-man's lands where nobody was safe, all because a 24-year-old lieutenant couldn't tell the difference between one Apache band and another. But wait, It gets worse. Within hours of Cochise's escape, Apache warriors begin appearing on the ridges around the stage station. These aren't random raiders. This is an organized response to what they see as an act of war against their chief and their chief's family. Cochise, bleeding but still thinking tactically, begins his own hostage-taking operation. If Bascom wants to play this game, fine. Cochise captures several Americans traveling through Apache Pass, including employees of the stage line. Now both sides have hostages, and both sides are furious. Bascom sends messages demanding that Cochise return his prisoners and surrender the mythical Felix Ward, who, remember, Cochise has never seen and knows nothing about. Cochise sends back demands that his family be released immediately. Neither side trusts the other. Both sides are operating from completely different cultural frameworks about honor, justice, and appropriate responses to perceived betrayal. And both sides are now committed to courses of action that make peaceful resolution almost impossible. The tragedy is that there was still a moment, just a brief moment, when this could have been resolved, when cooler heads could have prevailed. That moment came when Tom Jeffords arrived. Now, Tom Jeffords is one of those historical figures who seems almost too good to be true. He was a red-bearded mail contractor who had somehow, and nobody really knows how, earned Cochise's personal trust. He was probably the only white man in the entire Southwest who could have walked into Apache country, sat down with Cochise, and negotiated a solution both sides could live with. Jeffords tried. He really tried. He rode out to meet with Cochise, carrying messages back and forth between the Apache chief and the army officers. For a few days it looked like maybe, just maybe, they could work something out, but the situation had already gone too far. Too much pride was at stake on both sides. Too much fear. Too much misunderstanding. The exchanges began. Bascom hanged Cochise's brother and nephews. Cochise killed his American prisoners. And just like that, any possibility of peaceful resolution died with those men swaying from trees in Apache Pass. But here's what makes this tragedy even more heartbreaking. About 6 months later, the real kidnappers were found. Felix Ward had been taken by a completely different Apache band, Pinal Apaches, not Chiricahuas. The whole crisis, the entire war that was now spreading across the Southwest, had been based on a mistake that could have been avoided if Lieutenant Bascom had simply asked a few basic questions. If he had bothered to learn that Apache bands were separate political entities. If he had taken the time to understand that Cochise's offer to help investigate was genuine. But by the time the truth came out, it was too late. The war had taken on a life of its own, and the Apache children, who had been learning to track mice across solid rock, they were about to get a very different kind of education. They were about to learn what it meant to be hunted. Within weeks of the Bascom affair, as it came to be called, wagon trains throughout the Southwest were being attacked. Stage stations were burned. Mines were abandoned. Ranchers fled to fortified towns or died trying to defend isolated homesteads. The Apache children who had been playing war games in the mountain meadows were now learning the real thing. They learned how to spot dust clouds on the horizon 20 miles away. Not the dust of deer or elk, but the dust of cavalry columns. They learned to sleep with weapons within reach, and one ear always listening for the sound of approaching horses. They learned new games, too. Games like Silent Camp, where an entire band of 50 or 60 people, men, women, children, elders, would practice moving through their daily routines without making a single sound that might carry to enemy scouts. Children who whispered or cried or dropped cooking implements faced consequences that were immediate and harsh. Because their mistakes could get everyone killed, the children learned to read the intentions of circling vultures. Were they marking a natural death or the site of a battle? They learned to distinguish the neighing of Apache horses from the neighing of cavalry mounts. They learned which plants could be eaten raw and which required cooking fires that might give away their position. Most importantly, they learned that the Americans were different from the Mexicans in ways that went beyond technology and numbers. The Mexicans fought for territory, for resources, for political control. When they won a battle, they took what they wanted and usually left the survivors alone. The Americans seemed to be fighting for something else entirely. They weren't just trying to control Apache territory. They were trying to eliminate Apache culture, to make Apaches disappear entirely, either through death or through forced transformation into something that wasn't Apache anymore. This was total war in a way that Apache children had never experienced. And they were adapting to it with the same systematic thoroughness their ancestors had brought to survival in the desert. But adaptation has costs. Children who should have been learning the names of plants and the songs of their grandmothers were instead learning to kill silently in the darkness. Boys who should have been perfecting their archery for hunting were learning to use captured rifles to kill human beings. Girls who should have been learning to weave baskets were learning to load ammunition and tend gunshot wounds. A generation of Apache children was being shaped by war in ways that would mark them for life, and the war was just getting started, because down in Tucson, military commanders were looking at maps and casualty reports and making plans that would change everything. They were planning something that Apache children couldn't possibly prepare for. No matter how tough they were or how well they adapted, they were planning to bring in a general who understood that you don't defeat Apaches by fighting them on their terms. They were bringing in George Crook, and when Crook arrived, the real war would begin. General George Crook stepped off the train in Tucson in June of 1882, and you could practically hear the Apache world holding its breath. Not because they knew who he was yet, though they'd learn soon enough, but because Crook represented something fundamentally different from every military commander who had come before him. Previous army officers had tried to fight Apaches like they were fighting Confederate cavalry or Plains Indians. They'd used conventional tactics, conventional thinking, conventional assumptions about what warfare looked like, and the Apaches had made them look like amateurs. Crook was different. Crook had spent decades fighting unconventional enemies in unconventional terrain. He'd learned hard lessons in places like Oregon and Idaho, where he'd battled Paiutes and Modocs who used guerrilla tactics that made conventional military doctrine useless. But more than that, Crook understood something that his predecessors had missed entirely. The key to defeating Apaches wasn't superior firepower or overwhelming numbers. Those things helped, sure, but they weren't enough. The key was to turn Apache advantages into Apache vulnerabilities. Let me explain what I mean by that. For 20 years, the Apache had been nearly invincible because they knew the terrain better than anyone else. They could disappear into country that would kill pursuing soldiers within days. They could find water where their enemies would die of thirst. They could read the landscape like a book while their pursuers were essentially blind. But here's the thing about local knowledge. It only works if you're the only one who has it. Crook's first innovation was to recruit Apache scouts. Now, this wasn't entirely new. Other commanders had used Apache guides before, but Crook systematized it. He turned Apache scouts into the core of his entire strategy, and he did it in a way that exploited the deepest fractures in Apache society, because here's something most people don't understand about the Apache. Wars. This wasn't really one unified conflict between Apaches and Americans. This was dozens of separate conflicts involving different Apache bands with different leaders, different grievances, different strategic situations. Some bands had been fighting for decades and were exhausted. Their warriors were dead or scattered. Their women and children were starving. When Crook offered them a choice between continued warfare and reservation life with guaranteed food and safety, many chose the reservation. But, and this is crucial, Crook didn't just let these former enemies retire to peaceful lives. He recruited them. He turned their intimate knowledge of Apache tactics and terrain into weapons against the bands that were still fighting. It was brilliant, and it was absolutely devastating. Think about what this meant for someone like Geronimo, who was still trying to maintain Apache independence. Suddenly, the tracks his warriors left weren't just being followed by clumsy cavalry soldiers who couldn't tell a horse print from a mule print. They were being tracked by men who had learned those same tracking skills in the same harsh schools, from the same teachers, men like Ndee and Apache. Apache scouts who could follow a war party's trail across solid rock, through running streams, across terrain where experienced white trackers would lose the trail within hours. The psychological impact was enormous. For the first time in their lives, Apache warriors were being hunted by people who were as good at this as they were. But Crook's innovations went far beyond just recruiting scouts. He revolutionized the entire infrastructure of warfare in the Southwest. Previous commanders had tried to fight Apaches from fixed bases, forts connected by well-known roads where supply wagons could travel safely. The Apaches had simply avoided the forts and ambushed the supply trains. Easy. Crook threw out that entire playbook. Instead of fixed bases, he created mobile columns that could follow Apache war parties anywhere. Instead of heavy wagons that needed roads, he used pack mules that could go wherever a man could walk. Instead of fighting from defensive positions, he carried the fight directly to Apache strongholds that had never been threatened before. And then there was the heliograph system. This is one of those technological innovations that seems almost science-fictional when you first hear about it. Crook set up a network of mirror stations on mountain peaks throughout Arizona and New Mexico. During daylight hours, these stations could flash messages between points hundreds of miles apart in a matter of hours. Picture this: an Apache war party raids a settlement near the Mexican border. Within hours, not days, hours, every military post in the territory knows about it. The direction they're traveling, the number of warriors, the composition of the group. By the time the raiders are making camp for the night, columns of soldiers and scouts are already moving to intercept them. For Apache leaders who had grown up in a world where information traveled at the speed of a running horse, this was like fighting an enemy who could see the future. But the most devastating part of Crook's strategy was how he systematically eliminated Apache advantages won by when traditional Apache tactics depended on mobility. Hit hard, disappear fast, strike somewhere else before the enemy could respond. But Crook's pack mule columns could move almost as fast as Apache war parties, and they could keep moving for weeks without resupply. Apache survival depended on intimate knowledge of water sources, hiding places, and escape routes. But Apache scouts knew all the same places. Suddenly there were no secret refuges, no hidden springs, no mountain strongholds that couldn't be found and surrounded. Most devastatingly, Apache warfare had always been sustainable because casualties were limited. A successful raid might involve 20 warriors and result in 1 or 2 injuries. Even unsuccessful raids rarely cost more than a handful of lives. Apache populations could absorb those losses indefinitely, but now every raid risked total disaster. Because when Crook's columns caught up with a war party, they didn't just defeat it, they destroyed it. They captured the horses, the weapons, the supplies. They scattered the survivors so thoroughly that it took months to regroup. If they could regroup at all, the mathematics of Apache warfare, which had favored the Apache for decades, suddenly shifted decisively in favor of the army. And in the middle of all this strategic transformation, we have Geronimo. Now, Geronimo is probably the most famous Apache in history, but he's also the most misunderstood. Most people think of him as some kind of savage war chief, leading bloodthirsty raids out of pure hatred for whites. That's not even close to the truth. Geronimo was a medicine man who became a war leader out of necessity, not choice. His real name was Goyakla, one who yawns. He only became known as Geronimo after Mexican soldiers, fighting for their lives against his attacks, started calling out to Saint Jerome for protection. Geronimo! Geronimo! And the name stuck. But here's what made Geronimo truly dangerous. He had power. In Apache culture, power isn't just spiritual authority. It's practical, tactical capability. Geronimo's power allowed him to see enemies in visions before they arrived, to know when soldiers were approaching his camp, hours before his scouts reported them. To predict which trails would be safe and which would lead to ambushes, you can call it superstition if you want. But Geronimo used his visions to evade capture for over a decade while being hunted by 5,000 soldiers, 1/4 of the entire United States Army. Maybe his power was heightened. Awareness and exceptional pattern recognition. Maybe it was something else entirely. All I know is, it worked. And working with Geronimo was a warrior woman whose abilities seemed to border on the supernatural. Her name was Lozan, and she was Geronimo's most trusted lieutenant. Sister of the great Chief Victorio, Lozan had chosen the warrior's path over marriage and motherhood. She could ride as hard as any man, fight as fiercely as any warrior, and she possessed a power that made her invaluable to any war party she joined. Lozan could stand in an open area with her arms outstretched and sense the direction of approaching enemies through tingling sensations in her palms. She turned slowly in a circle, and when her palms began to tingle, she'd know that danger lay in that direction. The stronger the sensation, the closer the threat. Modern people want to explain this away, right? Maybe she was unconsciously picking up on environmental cues, changes in wind patterns, dust in the air, the behavior of birds or animals. Maybe her power was just exceptional situational awareness combined with a lifetime of training in wilderness survival. Fine. Explain it however you want. But Lozan used this ability to guide Apache families to safety dozens of times over a career that spanned decades. She guided mothers with infants across hundreds of miles of desert, always managing to avoid the cavalry patrols that were hunting them. She helped war parties find safe routes through territory, crawling with enemies. Whatever you want to call it, Lozan's power worked. And in the harsh mathematics of Apache survival, that was all that mattered. But by 1885, even power wasn't enough. The net was drawing tight around the last free Apaches in ways that made traditional escape impossible. Crook had over 5,000 soldiers in the field, more military force than had been used in some entire wars. His heliograph network meant that Apache movements were tracked almost in real time. His Apache scouts could follow trails that white soldiers couldn't even see. Most devastatingly, the traditional Apache strategy of disappearing into Mexico was no longer viable. Crook had negotiated agreements with Mexican authorities that allowed American forces to cross the border in pursuit. Suddenly there was no sanctuary, no place where exhausted Apache families could rest and regroup beyond the reach of their pursuers. The children who had learned to move silently through their homeland, who had mastered the art of survival in the harshest country in North America, were learning new lessons now. They were learning what it felt like to be prey instead of predators. Apache children who had never known hunger were now eating cactus pulp to survive. Children who had been raised in the old traditions of Apache hospitality and sharing were learning to ration water so carefully that every drop was precious. Children who had played in mountain meadows were now learning to recognize the sound of different types of military equipment from miles away. They were learning to walk for 20 hours at a stretch without complaint, to remain absolutely silent when enemy patrols passed within arm's reach, to sleep in positions where they could run at the first sound of approaching danger. Most heartbreakingly, they were learning to say goodbye, because the simple mathematics of the situation were becoming impossible to ignore. Every month, the circle grew smaller. Every raid resulted in more casualties the Apaches couldn't afford. Every successful escape used up resources, horses, ammunition, supplies that couldn't be replaced. Geronimo's band, which had once numbered in the hundreds, was down to fewer than 50 people. And most of those weren't warriors. They were women, children, and elders who couldn't fight but couldn't be abandoned. Think about the impossible situation Geronimo faced. He was responsible for the survival of people who couldn't survive without his protection. But protecting them made it almost impossible to conduct the kind of mobile warfare that was their only hope of staying free. Women with infants couldn't move fast enough to evade Crook's columns. Elderly people couldn't endure the kind of forced marches that successful escapes required. Children couldn't remain silent for the hours at a time that hiding from patrols demanded, but abandoning them wasn't an option. That wasn't the Apache way. That wasn't what a leader did. So Geronimo kept running, kept fighting, kept using his power to find ways through what seemed like an impossible maze of enemies and obstacles. But the maze was getting smaller every day. And in Washington, politicians were asking questions that would soon make the military situation irrelevant. They were asking why 1/4 of the United States Army was being used to hunt down fewer than 50 Apaches. They were asking about costs, about casualties, about the political implications of a war that seemed to drag on forever without resolution. General Nelson Miles was getting ready to replace General Crook, and Miles had very different ideas about how this war should end, ideas that would lead to Skeleton Canyon and betrayals that would echo through generations. But before we get to that betrayal, we need to understand what was happening to the Apache children during these final hunts, because they were learning lessons that would shape not just their own futures, but the future of Apache culture itself. They were learning that sometimes survival requires choices their grandparents never had to make. That sometimes being Apache means adapting to situations that traditional Apache wisdom never anticipated. And they were about to learn the cruelest lesson of all, that sometimes your enemies lie. September 4th, 1886. If you're looking for the single date when Apache independence died, that's it. Not in some great battle with cavalry charges and dramatic last stands. In a quiet canyon in southeastern Arizona, with handshakes and promises that were lies from the moment they were spoken. General Nelson Miles had replaced George Crook, and Miles had very different ideas about how to end the Apache wars. Crook had been a soldier's soldier. He respected Apache fighting ability, understood their tactics, even admired their resilience. Miles was a politician in uniform. He didn't want to defeat the Apaches. He wanted to solve the Apache problem once and for all, and Miles understood something that Crook had missed. This war wasn't really about military victory anymore. It was about public relations. Back in Washington, newspapers were asking uncomfortable questions. Why was it taking the United States Army so long to defeat a handful of savages? Why were American taxpayers spending millions of dollars to hunt down fewer than 50 Apache men, women, and children? Why couldn't the most powerful military in the world handle what looked like a simple police action? Miles had answers to those questions. But his answers required a level of deception that would have made Crook physically sick. The stage was Skeleton Canyon, a narrow defile in the Chiricahua Mountains along the Arizona-New Mexico border. The name should have been a warning. Local legend said the canyon got its name from the bleached bones of travelers who had tried to cross Apache country without permission. Whether that was true or not, it was about to become prophetic in ways nobody could have imagined. Geronimo was exhausted. Not just physically, though that was certainly true. The man was in his 60s, and he'd been running from the army for over a year in some of the harshest terrain in North America. But more than physical exhaustion, he was spiritually exhausted. His power had been showing him visions for months, and those visions were all dark. He saw Apache children dying far from their homeland. He saw Apache women weeping for warriors who would never return. He saw Apache elders forgotten by their own grandchildren. But most disturbing of all, his power was showing him his own death if he continued fighting. Not death in battle, that he could have accepted. Death by betrayal, by poison, by methods that no Apache warrior should have to face. So when General Miles sent word through intermediaries that he wanted to negotiate, not just a temporary ceasefire, but a permanent end to hostilities, Geronimo was ready to listen. The terms Miles offered seemed reasonable, even generous. The Apache families would be reunited with their relatives who were already on reservations in Arizona. The warriors would be treated as prisoners of war temporarily, but only until a permanent settlement could be arranged. There would be no executions, no punishments for past raids. Most importantly, the Apache would be allowed to remain in their traditional homeland. It was everything Geronimo could have hoped for. Almost too good to be true. It was too good to be true, but Geronimo didn't know that yet. And neither did the Apache women and children who began gathering at Skeleton Canyon in early September, believing they were coming to a reunion with family members they hadn't seen in years. Let me paint you a picture of that gathering. These weren't just warriors coming to surrender. These were families. Mothers carrying infants who had been born in hiding caves during the worst years of the war. Children who had never known any life except running from soldiers. Elderly grandparents who had somehow survived forced marches that would have killed people half their age. One of those children was a little girl, let's call her Little Moon, who had spent her entire 7-year life as a fugitive. She had been born in a hidden canyon while cavalry patrols searched for her parents. She had learned to walk while her family moved constantly through the mountains, never staying in one place for more than a few nights. Little Moon had never seen a house, never slept in the same place twice, never played with children outside her immediate family. Her toys were rocks and sticks. Her playground was some of the most dangerous country in North America. Her lullabies were the distant sounds of coyotes and the closer sounds of sentries watching for enemies. But at Skeleton Canyon, for the first time in her life, Little Moon was going to see other Apache children. Children from the reservation who had been living in something like safety. Maybe she could learn new games. Maybe she could hear stories she'd never heard before. She was so excited she could barely contain herself as the families approached the meeting site. Geronimo himself was traveling with his wives. He had several, as was traditional for prominent Apache leaders, his children and grandchildren. Lozen was there, her warrior days finally behind her. The medicine man Fun was there with his family, despite his cheerful name having seen enough horror to last several lifetimes. In total, 38 people. 16 warriors and 22 women and children. That was all that remained of the free Apaches. The last holdouts against American expansion into the Southwest. 38 people had tied down 5,000 soldiers for over a year. The meeting took place under a white flag, with interpreters and military officials and all the formal protocols of international diplomacy. Because that's what this was supposed to be, a negotiation between sovereign powers, conducted according to the rules of civilized warfare. General Miles was personally present, which gave the proceedings additional weight. This wasn't some field commander making promises he couldn't keep. This was the military commander of the entire Department of Arizona, speaking with the full authority of the United States government. Miles repeated his promises. Reunification with family members. Temporary prisoner of war status, followed by permanent settlement. No punishments for past actions. Permission to remain in Apache homeland. And Geronimo, reading the faces of his exhausted followers, seeing the hope in their eyes as they imagined being reunited with relatives they hadn't seen in years, made the hardest decision of his life. He agreed to surrender, not just for himself, but for all of them. The warriors, the women, the children, the elders, everyone who had followed him through years of impossible hardship. The formal surrender ceremony was conducted with military honors. Geronimo and his warriors laid down their weapons. Military photographers captured the moment for posterity, the end of the Apache Wars, the final pacification of the American Southwest. Little Moon and the other children watched in fascination as their fathers and grandfathers went through rituals they didn't understand, speaking with blue-coated men in a language that sounded harsh and strange. But the children were excited. They were going to see their cousins from the reservation. They were going to sleep in real buildings, eat regular meals, maybe even go to school. The betrayal began almost immediately. Instead of being taken to meet their Arizona relatives, the Apache families were escorted to Bowie Station, where a train was waiting. Not a passenger train, cattle cars. The same kind of cars used to transport livestock to slaughter. Miles had lied about everything. The Apaches weren't going to be reunited with their Arizona relatives. They were being shipped to prison camps in Florida. They weren't going to remain in their homeland. They were being exiled to the opposite end of the continent, to a climate and culture as different from Apache country as it was possible to imagine. And it wasn't just Geronimo's followers who were being betrayed. The Apache scouts who had served the army faithfully for years, men like Dutchy and Alchese, who had tracked their own people for the American military, found themselves prisoners too. Think about what this meant to those scouts. They had made the hardest choice anyone can make. They had chosen their family's survival over their loyalty to old friends and relatives. They had served the army faithfully, risking their lives in dozens of engagements, helping to end a war that was destroying their people. And Miles' reward for their service was to treat them as prisoners of war, identical to the warriors they had helped capture. It was a betrayal so complete, so comprehensive, that it destroyed any possibility of future cooperation between Apaches and the American government for generations. But the worst betrayal was what happened to the children. Little Moon and the other Apache children were loaded into cattle cars at Bowie Station on September 8, 1886. These were cars that had been used to transport livestock just days earlier. The floors were still covered with straw, soaked in animal waste. The smell was overwhelming. The children had never seen a train before. To them, this iron monster looked like some kind of supernatural creature that was going to devour them. The noise of the steam engine, the grinding of metal wheels on rails, the whistle that sounded like the screaming of tortured spirits. It was more terrifying than any enemy they had faced in the mountains. But their parents were with them, and their parents tried to explain that this was just another kind of travel, like riding horses, but faster. They would be at their destination soon, and then they would see their relatives and everything would be better. The Apache families were packed into 4 cattle cars with minimal ventilation and no sanitary facilities. 442 people in cars designed for livestock. Men, women, children, infants, elderly grandparents who could barely stand, all crammed together in conditions that would have been considered inhumane for animals. As the train began to move, pulling away from everything the Apache children had ever known, they pressed their faces against the slats in the walls of the cattle cars, watching their sacred mountains disappear. Little Moon watched until the mountains were just blue shadows on the horizon, then until they disappeared entirely. She was seeing her homeland for the last time, though she didn't know it yet. The journey to Florida took 8 days. 8 days in cattle cars, in the middle of September, traveling through some of the hottest country in America. 8 days without adequate food, water, or sanitation. 8 days breathing air thick with the stench of human waste and the residual smell of the cattle that had traveled in these same cars. At every stop, crowds gathered to stare at the savage prisoners. Word had spread along the railroad lines that the famous Geronimo was being transported, and people came from miles around to get a look at the Apache leader who had defied the United States Army for so long. Some of the spectators were merely curious. Others were hostile, shouting insults and threats at the cattle cars. Some threw objects, rocks, rotten vegetables, anything that might express their hatred for people they saw as murderers and savages. The Apache children, peering out through the slats, saw faces twisted with hatred looking back at them. They heard words they didn't understand, but recognized as cruel. They felt the impact of objects thrown with intent to hurt, and slowly, gradually, they began to understand that their parents' promises about reunification and better times ahead were based on lies their parents had been told. Little Moon's mother tried to explain what was happening. But how do you explain betrayal to a 7-year-old? How do you tell a child that the people her father trusted were liars? How do you prepare a mountain child for life in a swamp prison thousands of miles from everything she has ever known? All she could say was that they were going to the place where the sun rises, where it was very different from home, where they would have to learn new ways to survive, and that maybe they would never see home again. When the train finally stopped in Florida and the cattle car doors were opened, the Apache families stumbled out into a world that might as well have been another planet. Instead of dry mountain air, There was humidity so thick it felt like drowning. Instead of clear desert skies, there was a canopy of vegetation so dense it blocked out the sun. Instead of familiar landmarks and sacred places, there were swamps and marshes that stretched to the horizon, and looming over everything, the ancient stone walls of Fort Marion, built by Spanish conquistadors centuries earlier, now converted into a prison that would hold Apache families for the next 8 years. Little Moon looked up at those walls and began to cry. Not the quiet tears that Apache children learned to shed silently in the mountains, but the desperate wailing of a child who understands that her world has ended and she is powerless to do anything about it. Her mother held her close and whispered the only comfort she could offer. "We are still Ndee. We are still the people. As long as we remember who we are, they cannot take that from us." But even as she spoke those words, she wondered if they were true, because the people who had brought them to this place had already proven that they could take everything else: freedom, homeland, hope, and truth itself. The only question was whether Apache identity was strong enough to survive what was coming next. If Fort Marion was a laboratory for destroying Apache identity, then Carlisle Indian Industrial School was the factory that mass-produced the destruction. By 1890, when Apache children from Florida began arriving in Pennsylvania, Captain Richard Henry Pratt had perfected his system for what he called killing the Indian to save the man. And make no mistake, this was industrial-scale cultural genocide. Carlisle wasn't just a school. It was a machine designed to take Native American children and transform them into something that wasn't Native American anymore. Pratt had studied the most advanced educational theories of his time, borrowed techniques from military training, prison reform, and industrial management, then combined them all into a system that attacked indigenous identity with scientific precision. The famous before and after photographs that Carlisle took of every student weren't just documentation, they were propaganda. Marketing materials designed to show potential donors and government officials how completely the school could transform savage children into civilized Americans. But what those photographs couldn't show was the psychological warfare happening inside the children's minds. Little Moon, now calling herself Mary, because that was the name the school had assigned her, stood in line with 40 other Apache children as they underwent what Pratt called orientation. She was 16 years old, had already survived 8 years in Fort Marion, and thought she understood what white institutions could do to Apache children. She was wrong. Fort Marion had been crude, brutal, direct. Eat this forbidden food or starve. Cut your hair or be punished. Speak English or face solitary confinement. The rules were clear, the consequences obvious. Carlisle was more sophisticated, more insidious. Instead of simply forbidding Apache identity, it convinced Apache children that Apache identity was something to be ashamed of. The process began with what Pratt called cultural diagnosis. Each Apache child was interviewed by school officials who documented their level of savagery and developed individualized plans for their civilization. Little Moon's file, which still exists in the National Archives, described her as moderately intelligent but deeply contaminated by Apache superstitions. Shows dangerous attachment to tribal identity. Requires intensive intervention to overcome primitive worldview. Think about that language. Contaminated. Dangerous. Attachment. These weren't descriptions of a human being. They were medical terms used to describe disease and the treatment for this. Disease was comprehensive re-education. The Apache children were immediately separated from each other and assigned to dormitories with children from different tribes. No more than 2 Apaches in any single room. The theory was that without reinforcement from other Apache children, tribal identity would naturally weaken. They were forbidden from speaking Apache, not just in class, but anywhere on campus. Unlike Fort Marion, where the prohibition was enforced through punishment, Carlisle used a more sophisticated approach: peer pressure. Children were taught to monitor each other's behavior and report violations. Speaking your native language didn't just get you in trouble with the authorities, it disappointed your classmates, who had been taught to see tribal behavior as backsliding that hurt the entire community. Little Moon found herself in the impossible position of having to choose between protecting other Apache children and maintaining her standing with the larger student body. When she heard a younger Apache boy whispering in their native language, should she report him? Should she risk her own position to protect him? Should she pretend she hadn't heard? These weren't just disciplinary choices. They were moral puzzles designed to break down tribal solidarity and replace it with institutional loyalty. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of Carlisle's system was how it used education itself as a weapon against indigenous identity. Little Moon was enrolled in classes that taught her to read, write, and perform mathematical calculations. These were genuinely useful skills that would serve her well in the modern world. But the reading materials, the mathematical examples, the entire curriculum was designed to reinforce the message that Apache culture was inferior to white culture. In history class, she learned about the savage Indian Wars and how brave American soldiers had brought civilization to the wilderness. The textbooks described Apache leaders like Geronimo, her own relative, as bloodthirsty murderers who had terrorized innocent settlers. In literature class, she read stories about noble white pioneers and treacherous Indian villains. She memorized poems that celebrated American expansion and condemned tribal resistance. In science class, she learned that traditional Apache beliefs about medicine, weather, and natural phenomena were superstitions that had been disproven by modern scientific methods. Every lesson, in every subject, carried the same underlying message. Apache ways of knowing were wrong. Apache ways of living were primitive, and Apache ways of being were shameful obstacles to progress. But here's what made this particularly devastating. The education was real. Little Moon was genuinely learning skills that were valuable in the modern world. She was becoming literate, numerate, capable of functioning in American society in ways that would have been impossible if she had remained in traditional Apache communities. The cognitive dissonance was crushing. How do you reject an education that is obviously useful while maintaining pride in a cultural heritage that the education constantly portrays as worthless? Some Apache children resolved this tension by compartmentalizing school knowledge for school situations, Apache knowledge for private moments. They learned to code switch not just linguistically, but epistemologically, different ways of knowing for different contexts. But others internalized the conflict. They began to see their Apache heritage as an embarrassing burden that prevented them from fully participating in the modern world. They learned to be ashamed of their parents, their traditions, their own memories of life before Carlisle. Jason Betsinez was one of the Apache children who arrived at Carlisle in the early 1890s. Years later, he would write about the experience of watching his cousin die of tuberculosis in the drafty dormitories while learning to read from books that called his people bloodthirsty animals. The juxtaposition was intentional. Death and education, loss and opportunity, trauma and advancement, all mixed together so thoroughly that it became impossible to separate the benefits from the damage. But some Apache children found unexpected ways to turn Carlisle's own methods against itself. Sam Kenoy, another Apache student, realized that if white people valued written records so highly, then written records could be used to preserve Apache culture. He began secretly writing down traditional Apache stories in English, disguising cultural preservation as English composition exercises. His teachers praised his writing skills, never realizing that he was using their own educational system to maintain the very traditions they were trying to destroy. Ruth Dutton, one of the Apache girls at Carlisle, learned to sew Victorian dresses and operate industrial sewing machines. But she also secretly practiced traditional Apache beadwork patterns, incorporating them into white garments in ways that only other Apache girls would recognize. These were acts of resistance that required enormous sophistication. The children weren't just maintaining Apache culture, they were adapting it, finding ways to preserve essential elements while disguising them as assimilation. But this kind of resistance extracted its own psychological cost. Living a double life, constantly monitoring your own behavior, never being able to fully express who you are. This creates a kind of chronic stress that can last for decades. Many Carlisle graduates struggled with depression, anxiety, and identity confusion that followed them for the rest of their lives. And then there was the baseball team. This is one of those historical details that seems almost surreal. The Apache boys at Carlisle became famous for their athletic ability, particularly in baseball. They were so good that they played against college teams and professional clubs. Newspapers wrote articles about the savage Apache players who had learned to excel at America's national pastime. Think about the symbolism there. Apache boys, who had been raised to be warriors in the mountains of Arizona, now wearing uniforms and playing a game that represented everything American. They were literally performing their own cultural transformation for the entertainment of white audiences. But here's what makes it even more complex. Some of those boys genuinely loved baseball. They found joy, camaraderie, and success in a sport that had nothing to do with their traditional culture. Were they betraying their Apache heritage by excelling at an American game? Were they finding new ways to be Apache within American contexts? There are no simple answers to these questions, and that's exactly what made Carlisle so psychologically devastating. The school didn't just attack Apache identity, it made Apache identity impossible to define. What did it mean to be Apache when you could read English better than your parents could speak it? What did it mean to maintain traditional values when you had skills and knowledge that no traditional Apache had ever possessed? These children were being forced to navigate questions that their grandparents never had to face. They were becoming something new, not quite Apache in the traditional sense, but certainly not white either. Some found ways to integrate these contradictions into coherent identities. Charles Daklugi, son of the Apache chief Jew, used his Carlisle education to become an interpreter and advocate for Apache rights. He spent decades fighting legal battles on behalf of his people, using skills he had learned at the school that was designed to destroy his Apache identity. But others never found that integration. They remained caught between worlds, never fully comfortable in either, always feeling like imposters wherever they were. The measles epidemic of 1898 showed just how brutal this psychological displacement could be. When the disease swept through Carlisle, Apache children began dying in numbers that reminded everyone of the mortality rates at Fort Marion. But these weren't deaths from unfamiliar diseases in an alien climate. These were deaths from a disease that could have been prevented with better medical care and sanitation. The children were dying because they were expendable, because the school's mission was more important than their individual lives. Because they were raw material in an industrial process, not human beings deserving of protection and care. Little Moon, Mary, watched her roommate die calling for her mother in Apache. The girl had been at Carlisle for 3 years, had learned to read and write, could sew and cook and perform all the domestic tasks that white society expected of women. But when death came, all of that fell away. In her final moments, she reverted to the language and identity that Carlisle had spent years trying to erase. The school officials recorded her death as another casualty of the epidemic. They buried her in the school cemetery with a Christian service conducted in English. Her gravestone bore her English name and the dates of her birth and death, but Little Moon knew that something more than a person had died in that dormitory room. A whole way of understanding the world, a connection to generations of ancestors, a set of skills and knowledge that couldn't be learned from textbooks, all of that had died with her roommate, and it was dying a little bit every day in every Apache child who remained at Carlisle. By the time Little Moon graduated in 1896, after 6 years at the school, she was a different person than the one who had arrived from Fort Marion. She could speak, read, and write English fluently. She had learned domestic skills, basic accounting, and enough general education to function in American society. But she had also learned lessons that would shape the rest of her life in ways she couldn't yet understand. She had learned that success in white society required constant performance, constant monitoring of her own behavior to ensure she was presenting the right image. She had learned that her Apache heritage was something to be managed, revealed selectively, hidden when necessary. Most devastatingly, she had learned that being Apache and being successful in America were fundamentally in tension with each other. The children graduating from Carlisle were being sent out into a world that had no clear place for them. Too Apache for white society, too assimilated for traditional Apache communities, carrying skills that were valuable but identities that were fractured. They were the products of an experiment in cultural engineering that had succeeded too well and failed too completely. Some would find ways to use their Carlisle education to help their people. Some would disappear into white society, their Apache identities becoming family secrets passed down in whispers. Some would struggle for decades to figure out who they were and where they belonged, but all of them would carry the psychological scars of having been told, repeatedly and systematically, that everything their grandparents had taught them was wrong. The long war for Apache minds was ending, and nobody had really won. April 4th, 1913. 27 years to the day after they had been loaded into cattle cars at Bowie Station, the surviving Apache prisoners of war finally stepped off a train in New Mexico as free people. But freedom is a complicated word when you're returning to a world that no longer exists. Of the 442 Apaches who had been shipped east in 1886, fewer than 200 survived to see this day. The rest lay buried in Florida swamps, Pennsylvania schoolyards, and Alabama prison camps, victims of disease, despair, and the systematic destruction of everything that had once made life worth living. But here's what makes this story remarkable. The ones who survived had not just endured 27 years of cultural warfare. They had found ways to preserve pieces of Apache identity that their captors thought had been destroyed forever. Little Moon, who was now 34 years old and calling herself Mary Naicha, stood on the platform at Deming Station and looked out at landscape that should have been familiar but felt alien. She had left as a 7-year-old child who knew every plant, every rock formation, every water source in the Chiricahua Mountains. She was returning as an adult who could read English poetry, but had forgotten the names of desert flowers in her own language. The children who had played in mountain meadows were now middle-aged adults with skills their grandparents never imagined needing. The toddlers who had been carried in cradleboards during the final hunts were now young men and women who could operate typewriters but couldn't track deer. They were ghosts returning to a homeland that had become equally ghostly. The Mescalero Apache reservation in New Mexico wasn't the Chiricahua homeland. That was still off-limits, still controlled by white ranchers and mining companies who had profited from Apache exile. The survivors were being offered a place among distant relatives who spoke a similar language but followed different customs and had their own complex relationships with the American government. It was freedom, but it was freedom in quotation marks. Eugene Chihuahua, son of the warrior chief who had died at Fort Marion, used his Carlisle education to write letters to Congress demanding compensation for stolen lands. His English was better than most government officials, his legal arguments more sophisticated than many lawyers could manage. But when he tried to perform the traditional ceremonies for welcoming his father's spirit home, he struggled to remember the words. This was the price of survival. The Apache who returned in 1913 carried within themselves the contradictions of everything they had endured. They were living bridges between two worlds that remained fundamentally at war with each other. Some had found ways to make this bridging into a kind of strength. Others remained trapped by it for the rest of their lives, Charles Daklugi became one of the most important Apache leaders of the 20th century, precisely because he could navigate both worlds with equal skill. He used his Carlisle education to fight legal battles for Apache rights, translating traditional concepts of justice into language that American courts could understand. But he also spent decades working with Apache elders to record traditional stories, ceremonies, and historical accounts that had survived 27 years of suppression. He understood that survival in the modern world required both adaptation and preservation. The stories he collected became crucial to later generations of Apaches who were trying to reconstruct cultural knowledge that had been deliberately fragmented. But here's what's most remarkable about these stories. Many of them had been secretly maintained by the most unlikely people. Remember the Apache scouts who had been betrayed by General Miles and shipped east along with the hostiles they had helped capture. Men like Dutchy and Alchesay, who had served the army faithfully only to find themselves treated as prisoners of war. Those men had spent 27 years in exile, carrying a double burden of guilt and knowledge. Guilt for having participated in the destruction of Apache independence. Knowledge of traditional ways that younger Apaches had never learned. In the years after their return, some of these former scouts became the most important teachers of traditional Apache culture. They had preserved not just stories and ceremonies, but detailed knowledge of the old homeland that had been lost to everyone else. It was as if the very people who had been seen as traitors to Apache culture became its most important guardians. The psychological complexity of this situation is almost impossible to grasp. Imagine being hated by your own people for betraying them, while simultaneously being their only connection to traditions they desperately wanted to recover. But the former scouts understood something that many others didn't. Survival had always required difficult choices, and preserving Apache culture in the 20th century would require choices that the 19th century Apaches never had to contemplate. The bacon that had once symbolized cultural destruction became part of the survival story they told. Apache elders who had been forced to eat pork in prison began incorporating those experiences into traditional narratives about endurance and spiritual testing. They developed new ceremonies, not traditional Apache ceremonies, but Apache ceremonies nonetheless that addressed the specific traumas of imprisonment, exile, and forced assimilation. These weren't compromises with white culture. They were Apache responses to Apache problems, developed by Apache people using Apache ways of understanding the world. Mary Naich learned these new ceremonies from her elders, just as she had learned to read and write from her white teachers. Both sets of knowledge became part of who she was, and both would be necessary for her children's survival, because by 1913, it was clear that Apache people weren't going to be allowed to return to some imaginary pre-contact state of traditional purity. The modern world was the only world available, and Apache culture would survive only by finding ways to remain Apache within that modern world. Some of the returning prisoners never managed this integration. They remained caught between identities, never comfortable in either traditional or assimilated contexts, but others found ways to use their bicultural skills in service of Apache survival. They became translators, not just of language, but of entire ways of understanding reality. They helped traditional Apache communities navigate the legal and political complexities of reservation life. They helped Apache children growing up in government schools maintain connections to cultural knowledge that the schools were still trying to erase. Most importantly, they kept Apache identity alive as something dynamic rather than static. They refused to let Apache culture become a museum piece, insisting that it could adapt and change while remaining fundamentally Apache. The children who had hidden pebbles from Arizona in their pockets at Fort Marion grew up to become adults who understood that cultural preservation sometimes requires cultural innovation. By the 1920s and 30s, a new generation of Apache leaders was emerging, People like Mildred Cleghorn, who would become the first Apache woman tribal chairperson, carried forward both the trauma and resilience of the prisoner of war experience. Cleghorn grew up hearing stories from the survivors about life before imprisonment, during imprisonment, and the long process of rebuilding Apache communities after release. But she also grew up in a world where Apache women could become political leaders in ways that hadn't been possible in traditional Apache society. She used skills learned from necessity, the ability to navigate between cultures, to translate concepts across worldviews, to maintain identity while adapting to changing circumstances, to advocate for Apache rights in contexts that previous generations of leaders couldn't have imagined. The boarding school experience, which had been designed to destroy Apache identity, had inadvertently created a generation of Apache leaders with unprecedented skills for dealing with the modern world. But the costs of this transformation remained enormous. Whole areas of traditional Apache knowledge had been lost forever. Languages had been damaged, ceremonies forgotten, environmental knowledge disrupted by decades of separation from the homeland. The psychological scars of imprisonment and forced assimilation would be passed down through generations. Children and grandchildren of the prisoners would struggle with identity issues, historical trauma, and the complex legacy of survival strategies that had required their ancestors to hide who they were. Apache families spent decades trying to heal relationships that had been damaged by forced separations, competing loyalties, and the impossible choices that imprisonment had required. But here's what's most important to understand about this story. It didn't end with the return from exile. The Apache people who stepped off that train in Deming in 1913 began a new phase of cultural survival that continues to this day. They took the fragments of traditional knowledge that had survived 27 years of systematic destruction and began rebuilding. Apache culture in forms that could survive in the 20th century. Apache ceremonies that had been outlawed for decades began to flourish again, taught by elders who had whispered them in Florida prisons and Pennsylvania dormitories. Traditional Apache foods, traditional Apache arts, traditional Apache stories all began to re-emerge, changed by the experience of suppression, but recognizably Apache nonetheless. Languages that had been forbidden began to be spoken openly again, taught to children who had been born into freedom, but needed to learn about the price that freedom had cost. In the 21st century, Apache ceremonies that were almost lost forever are being performed by people whose great-great-grandparents learned them from survivors of the prisoner of war experience. The mountains still remember the people, and the people, against all odds and despite everything that was done to destroy their memory, still remember the mountains. This is not a story with a happy ending, because the costs were too enormous for any ending to be truly happy. Entire generations of Apache children paid prices that no children should ever have to pay. But it's also not a story with a tragic ending, because Apache culture survived. Apache people survived. Apache identity survived, not unchanged but unbroken. Must be children who had learned to eat bacon without vomiting grew up to become adults who taught their own children that surviving in an enemy's world sometimes requires tactics that your grandparents wouldn't recognize. But the goal remains the same, ensuring that Apache people continue to exist as Apache people. The 7-year-old girl who had cried at the walls of Fort Marion became a grandmother who could teach her descendants both how to navigate American institutions and how to maintain connections to sacred places that existed long before those institutions were ever imagined. The Bacon prison had tried to kill the Apache identity in order to save the Apache people. Instead, it created Apache people tough enough to save their own identity. That may be the most Apache outcome of all.